I am so delighted to welcome you to our first Longwood seminar for 2013. And we are starting a little bit late because we still have people coming in. We have well over 500 people here tonight, which is really exciting. And I think it's truly a tribute to our speakers. This is our 13th year offering the Mini Med School, and there are so many familiar faces here. May I just ask if this is your first, to raise your hand if this is your first Mini Med School? Fabulous, fabulous. Well, we're hoping that you come back year after year as so many other people do. So really, truly, thank you for being here. We want to share with you that once again this year, our topics were chosen by our Facebook friends primarily. And we had over 500 votes, and tonight's topic was definitely one of the most popular. So we would like to invite you now to join us for the 3 remaining seminars. The Power of Z's, Uncovering Why Sleep is Essential to Our Well-Being and How to Get More of It, which will be held on March 13th. It's All in Your Head, Building Better Brains Through Neuroengineering, held on April 2nd. And Beyond Belief, Exploring the Connection Between Personal Beliefs and Physical Health, which will be held on April 23rd. So now I have a few announcements, and I was going to apologize because for 5 years I've been introducing the seminars, and I make the same announcements at every seminar year after year, but there's a new audience, so you'll be hearing this for the first time. But for the first time this year, we have live streaming. So if you have friends who were not able to be here tonight, you can send them an email and let them know that you can find the link on our website and they can watch this live. And the next 3 seminars also will be live streamed, and you will be able to see that through the website. We also, as you may know, videotape and post the links to each of our seminars. Every year I tell people who are in the front rows, you will be in the video if you're sitting in rows 1 or 2. No one has ever moved, but I feel like I need to let you know that. And in an effort to support Harvard's sustainability goals, you'll notice that we did not print supplemental reading materials this year. And we hope you appreciate our need for cost savings and to be green. And we want you to know you can find a link to the reading materials online. And if you don't have access to a computer, if you see our staff at the registration desk, they will give you the address and locations for the Boston Public Libraries where you can find a computer. If you attend 3 or 4 of the seminars, you'll receive a certificate of completion for this year, for the 2013 series. If you attended 3 or 4 last year and did not yet pick up your certificate, we will have them out at the registration tables. You can pick them up later. Teachers can earn professional development points by attending all 4 seminars, and you need to complete an evaluation at the conclusion of each seminar. You'll find that at the registration table. You can drop it off after the seminar or just mail it back to us. We hope that you'll ask a lot of questions. This is a fascinating topic, and we will be collecting questions on index cards that our staff will be walking up and down the aisles, and we're looking for an engaging question and answer period this evening. The Longwood seminars continue to advance electronically a little bit more each year. We now have a mobile app. The mobile app, which you'll find on our website, includes the 2013 schedule, the locations of the seminar, and a link to download the supplemental reading materials. We will be live tweeting tonight, as I believe many of you will be. If you would like to be a part of our conversation, please use hashtag HMSMiniMed. And finally, out of courtesy to our speakers, please remember to turn off your cell phones. Now for why you came, tonight's program. Today's seminar is called Food and Vitamins and Supplements, Oh My! Demystifying Nutrition, the Value of Food, Vitamins, and Supplements. Information on diet trends, vitamins, and supplements are everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, television, radio. If you Google diet and nutrition, over 98 million websites appear. And who doesn't have a friend with who's quick to offer advice on the latest weight loss or vitamin fix. But the good news is we have experts here tonight, internationally recognized Harvard experts who study nutrition and who are going to help us navigate through this haze of information that can be confusing and conflicting. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to work with these individuals and to have them join us for this tonight. You'll hear from three of them. Dr. Eric Rim is an associate professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School. He's the director of the program in cardiovascular epidemiology. Dr. Howard Sesso is an associate epidemiologist at the Division of Preventative Medicine and Aging at Brigham and Women's Hospital and an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. But first you'll hear from Dr. Walter Willett, who will also be our moderator. He, as our other speakers, is highly accomplished, and his work is quite well known. Dr. Willett is the chair of the Department of Nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health and a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here and see that so many people are interested enough in nutrition to turn out at the end of a day and join us here for another hour and a half or so when you could be at home enjoying a very good dinner. Nutrition is a huge topic. It covers vast ranges of information about vitamins and minerals and types of fatty acids and proteins and fiber and how they relate to just dozens of different diseases and outcomes. So it's in a short period of time like this, we can only cover some little bits and pieces of the total topic. We're not going to give you a complete up-to-date overview on nutrition. It would be very hard to do that. But we are, as you heard, going to focus on two different areas. One is weight control and how diet can affect that. And second is on minerals and vitamins, and particularly supplementation with minerals and vitamins. But I think it's quite clear to everyone here that the progress we've made in electronic communications and information technology has helped transmit information in ways that we didn't imagine just a couple of decades ago. But it's, I think, very unclear whether it's really helped people understand diet and health and many other issues any better. In fact, there's just an overwhelming tsunami of information that almost everyone faces day to day. And I can just imagine for someone who's not working in the field of nutrition every day, it must be almost impossible to sort out what's believable, what you should act on, and what's just really false or completely misleading. Just as a couple examples of papers that got a lot of press over the last year. This one study, eggs are nearly as bad for your arteries as cigarettes. That's pretty horrible. Smoking is the #1 risk factor for coronary heart disease, and eggs, if they're really that bad, we should not get near them. And that, I'm sure, took a bunch of people by surprise. We were 30 or 40 years ago told that eggs were almost poison capsules for your arteries, and we were supposed to get away from them. So we did a lot of research. Other groups had done a lot of research and looking at egg consumption and following several hundred thousand people for several decades, and we just did not see an increase in risk of heart attacks, and we published that information. And that was, I think, getting out there that eggs were not as bad as had been made out. And then this paper comes along that eggs are just as bad as smoking. What's a person supposed to think about? And the problem was the nuances, the details of this study were really not described very well. It wasn't put in perspective of in context of the other information we have. This, as it turns out, was a really completely sloppy little study. It was just a cross-sectional view of what came into a clinic, and they didn't control for things like physical activity. It was really as bad as a study can be, but partly because it looked sensational, it got a lot of attention. That was pretty bad. And then just on January 1st, this paper came out, that Association of All-Cause Mortality with Overweight and Obesity a systematic review and meta-analysis. And basically, this paper said that grade 1 obesity, that sort of mild obesity, was not associated with higher mortality, and being overweight was actually associated with significantly lower mortality. Now, how many people heard about this study? Could you raise your hand? Yeah, a big part of the audience here. How many were confused by this study? Yeah, just as many people. And you should be confused by this study because it did get a lot of press. And it probably was not by accident that JAMA published this on January 1st. And it was going to be sensationalized. And at least it's a pretty good hypothesis. This was not random date that this was published. The problem was this analysis, it was not a real new study. It was a collection of published papers, but it, number one, omitted about 6 million people that were included in other studies but were not included in this analysis for really reasons that were irrelevant. And second, in this kind of analysis, the authors in the comparison group, which was the so-called normal weight group, enriched that group with people who were smoking, people who had cancer, other serious illness, people who were in their 80s and 90s, and as very often happens, people become frail and lose weight, their muscles shrink away before they actually die. And then they end up dying of dementia, pneumonia, those kinds of things. If that's sort of the way most of us, if we survive cancer and heart attacks and get to be 90, that's the normal way of dying. We don't just drop dead one day, but we often lose weight beforehand. So when that's the comparison group, and then you compare people who are overweight to this group that's over-enriched with people who have lost weight because of underlying illness, it's going to make the overweight group look good by comparison, and even the obese group look good by comparison. But anybody who understands this, or at least has it explained to them, really does understand that you're going to get the wrong answer doing that kind of analysis. And this, also the news didn't pick up that there had been, just in the last year or so, 2 very major analyses that where the investigators from dozens of studies around the world actually shared their original data, put it all on one computer, and analyzed the way you could really separate people who were lean because they were ill, who had underlying disease, people who were older and losing weight. You could take them out of the analysis. And when they did that, as you would expect, people who were overweight actually did have increased mortality, and people who were obese had substantially increased mortality. So this analysis was just completely misleading. And there are layers of problems with this. Why did JAMA take this in the first place? It's, I think, incomprehensible that they did, given much superior studies on the same topic had been published recently. Second, some of the media did not put this paper in context. And some papers did. Actually, USA Today did the best job. New York Times did a horrible job covering this paper. You'd think, you would sort of expect the New York Times to do better, but they really have not done well covering this kind of health issue. So it makes it hard for the public to sort out this information. And part of the trouble is that it's the studies with weird findings like this one that get the attention. The studies that showed that people who were overweight had higher mortality and people who were obese had even higher mortality, that got almost no press. It was sort of, ho-hum to a lot of people, and it wasn't going to make the headlines. So this study did. So what's the solution to this? It is a really serious problem. Of course, that's why you're here. One solution is to come to these kind of events where you can get into issues in more detail, look into the quality of the data, the quality of the studies that led to reports. We do have a website called Nutrition Source that our department has. If you're interested in that, we do try to cover topics like this and give the sort of the backroom story of what's gone into a report and put that in the context of the world's literature. If you want to go to that website, you just go to Google. That's where I start everything. And you type in Nutrition Source, you will come to our website. And we do cover background information and news stories as well. But it's a challenge. So anyway, tonight on 2 topics at least, you'll have a chance to get more in-depth, state-of-the-art knowledge about where we are, and I'm sure you'll have questions, and we welcome those, and I look forward to that discussion. So leading off, we have Dr. Eric Rim. You've already heard about Eric a little bit. I'm very pleased. He's a member of our Department of Nutrition at Harvard School of Public Health. We have really fantastic faculty members there, and he's also associate professor at Harvard Medical School and the director of the program in cardiovascular epidemiology. Dr. Rim has a very active research program studying diet, lifestyle characteristics, and cardiovascular disease, and he's published more than 400 articles in the medical literature during his 18 years on our faculty. He's also served on many important national committees such as the Institute of Medicine's dietary reference intakes for macronutrients, and he has been on the scientific advisory committee of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines in the review of the 2010 guidelines. He's received lots of international awards. Of course, goes around the world, gives talks at scientific meetings, but also Eric's very generously contributed a lot of his time to talking to audiences like this, non-scientific audiences, to help convey the information that we've gained with your tax dollar support. I do want to mention that you all have bought into this scientific process when you pay your taxes, and we hope that'll continue. So we worry about that a little bit these days. Eric has also given a series of lectures at the Culinary Institute of America's programs for major food services to really help guide them into preparing healthier menus. And he's also participated as a lecturer in the Healthy Kitchens, Healthy Lives program of the Culinary Institute of America, which is for physicians and other healthcare providers trying to fill in the gaps in education that most of us as physicians really experienced during our medical education. We didn't learn too much about nutrition, and we've got a lot of work to do to bring the healthcare community up to speed in the area of nutrition. So let me stop here and not take away any more of your time, Eric.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to be able to be here to share some information with you. It's also nice to be able to give a talk in front of my boss. So thank you, Walt. So I'm going to give a talk on demystifying nutrition, and it's meant to be 20 to 25 minutes long, so obviously I can't cover everything. But this is probably, as Walt mentioned, a lot of what you know about nutrition is what you've read in books or read online. And the question always is it fad or real? Now, when we had bookstores, or more bookstores, these used to be huge sections in the bookstores, because if you were clever, and if you could write a book, and if you had a good-looking face, you could write a book on nutrition. So the question is, are they fad or are they real? Do they work? And usually, key components of diets that you'd see in those books are, to start out, it would be sort of flashy salespeople, good-looking people on the cover. That attracts you into the book. And then there's a lot of topics that have been covered over the last 3 decades. High-fat, low-fat, and then low-carb, carb busters, and then glycemic index. These are all terms that you probably have heard and are probably confused about. Protein power, and now more recently, gluten-free. And then some people have just scrapped the diets altogether and said, let's just make shakes, mixes, blends, or just give you pills to solve the problem. So you get the idea. There's lots of different approaches to this. More recently, and actually most effectively, are when there are groups involved, when you don't do this alone, when you do it with a spouse, a friend, a wellness group at work, Weight Watchers, something where there's someone else around you that is in the fight together with you to try to lose weight. Unfortunately, there's a lot of outlets for what you get news, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about Dr. Oz, but how many of you watch Dr. Oz? Okay, so here's the deal. I got interviewed a month and a half ago by a local media outlet. Said, "Tell me about raspberry ketones. What do you know about this, Dr. Rim?" I said, "What? What are raspberry ketones?" So apparently Dr. Oz had a show on raspberry ketones, and they sold off the shelves everywhere because Dr. Oz, a cardiac thoracic surgeon, guided people on what to do about nutrition with the help of a nutritionist who was on one of his shows. Do you want to know what the evidence is for the benefits of raspberry ketones on human health? There's been one study done in China on 24 rats. They found some benefit for those rats that were fed 10% lard to their diets. They found some detrimental effects, yet Dr. Oz starts out the show by welcoming in the nutritionist saying, "Tell us about this miracle in a bottle." Dr. Oz actually has a lot of good science on his show. Unfortunately, there's a lot of sensationalism and a lot of shock that goes into it, which makes it sound a lot more like snake oil than anything else. It's not till the end of this 20-minute segment that he says, of course you should follow a healthy diet and exercise. It's in the first minute that there's sort of a sales on telling everybody to have this magic pill in a bottle because otherwise you'd have to have 90 pounds of raspberries to get the same amount of raspberry ketones. So it scares me when a lot of people get their diet advice from someone on television who essentially gets commercial. This is his website. He's actually paid, obviously gets money from people selling supplements. To go on this link, you have to watch a 10-second commercial about krill oil and omega-3. So obviously there's a lot of money from the food industry going into his show, not only the fact that he's selling something that has no data in human evidence, and he has a fair bit of scripting that goes on in this show. These are not free conversations that he's having with scientists. So please don't get just your evidence from Dr. Oz. So we have created our healthy eating plate with lots of members of our department sort of feeding into it. And this is something that you can get from our nutritionsource.org. And this really is 30 years of evidence that we put together on humans. And it sort of is a buildup or the My Pyramid. The government, the US government has a My Pyramid and a MyPlate. And this is really a sort of sharing that MyPlate image because I really think this is an important way to think about food, about what goes on our plate. And this gives us a lot more directives on things we should be eating. The other issue with diets is that it's not just what we think is really healthy, because all of us know that drinking soda all the time is probably not a good idea. And most of the US population knows that. And that's what goes on in our slow brain. Sort of we have that idea, that process of what a healthy diet is. Yet, when we go to a grocery store and see that huge rack of sugar-sweetened beverages sitting on the end of the aisle, a lot of people make the decision with their fast brain, saying, well, this is going to taste good. It'll be fine, just have this one thing. Or we walk into a fast food restaurant with great aspirations of what we're going to eat. Once we smell the French fries and see the menu and say, yeah, the double cheeseburger is going to be fine with French fries. So unfortunately, our slow brain and our fast brain don't always make the right decisions, but it's very easy for our fast brain to make the wrong decisions because it's triggered by something else. So we are all familiar with the obesity problem in this country. This was the prevalence of obesity going, the lighter states are those that have the lower prevalence of obesity, and the darker states are those that have the greater prevalence. And this is 25 years ago. This is 20 years ago. This is in 2006. And this is in 2010. So this is an epidemic of obesity in this country that is not caused by genetics, that is caused by the changes in what we eat. It's our fast brain making too many decisions based on a commercial we see, based on what's placed in front of us, based on the fact that it's really hard to eat healthy in our very busy lives. So there are no longer any states that have a prevalence of less than 20% of obesity. And obesity is defined as a BMI. It's a measure that we use. It's based on weight and height. And a BMI above 30 represents a 5'4" person weighing 30 pounds, or being 30 pounds overweight, or a 6-foot person being about 70 to 80 pounds overweight. So this is Michelangelo's David with a very healthy BMI of 21. We're thankful that Michelangelo did not do a sabbatical at Harvard, because this is what his rendition would have been. This is a BMI of 30, just to give you a sense of the difference between the problems we have with diet in this country. My apologies to any Michelangelo fans in the audience. So now there has been a lot of great science. This is not just science on raspberry ketones and on magic pills. There has been a lot of great science on diets that help in weight maintenance or weight loss. And a lot of studies, and what we have found over time is that you can't do a study for 6 months. All of us, if you sit with us and train us, can do a pretty good job of changing our diets for 6 months. However, we really yearn for fats. We really yearn for foods that we like eating. We don't like to be told to eat essentially a low-fat, cardboard-full diet. that it has to taste good to us in order for us to be something that we can want to, that we sustain and want to sustain. So lots of different diets have been tested. The one that has gotten the greatest test and the one that we really clearly see an answer for was about a $500 million study funded by the government to look at the effects of a low-fat diet among women. 20,000 women were randomized to a low-fat diet, and 30,000 women were given what was called usual care, essentially given the dietary guidelines and said you should eat this way. But people on the low-fat diet, over the first year, they had 18 meetings with counselors and nutritionists and were trained how to eat a low-fat diet at home. And that usually meant sort of healthful in design, high in fruits and vegetables and whole grains. And they really tried very hard. And people, as I said, over 6 months to a year, can do it if they really keep their mind to it. You may not be able to see this. The first dot down is the first year. This represents how effective the people were in their first year. Now, they didn't lose a lot of weight. They lost 5 pounds. And this is with 18 meetings with counselors and dietitians. That's a lot of labor and effort and time, and probably would be implausible to do with everybody in this country. People lost weight. Look what happens over time. They just give up. They just can't do it anymore. It doesn't taste good. They don't like it. And by about three or 4 years, they're essentially back where they were before. And in many cases, by the time you got to the end, compliance was really terrible in this study. And what we conclude is that trying to get people to eat a low-fat diet, most types of low-fat diets, is very hard to do. You can eat a healthy low-fat diet. It's very hard to do, and most people eventually yearn for different types of food in their diets. So low-fat diets probably are not the solution. I should have said they're not the solution here. They are the solution in the short term. If you have to fit into a wedding dress in 3 months, if you have to get into your tuxedo for a reunion, it might work for 3 or 6 months. But that's not what we should be thinking about in terms of long-term health. So it has poor long-term compliance. It is not a long-term solution. And this is kind of an interesting study that I won't go into all the details, but this was done at Tufts, where they said, let's try 4 different diets. Let's do them back to back. Which one's better? Is it the Atkins, the Zone, the Weight Watchers, or the Ornish, which is a very low-fat diet? And they did them, and they schooled people, and they followed them for a year. And then on the bottom, they mapped how compliant the people were at the end of the year. So you can see the people that were most compliant lost the most weight. That's weight loss on the y-axis. But you can see there was absolutely no difference if you were compliant to the Atkins diet worked, to the Zone, to the Weight Watchers, or the Ornish. It essentially was a measure of compliance regardless of what people were being schooled on what to eat. So that does suggest to you that for weight loss, it may be more important for you to find something that you like and that you stick with and that you don't cheat on, and that's something you can find support, because that's what will work, as opposed to trying to buy a book and being prescripted. So when you are fed the food, the diets I've showed you so far, people were sort of free to roam. They were told what to eat, but they still were free to roam and go and buy and eat what they wanted. This is a study that was done in a nuclear reactor facility in Israel. Nothing gets into a nuclear reactor facility in Israel. So no snacks were being snuck in. In Israel, most of their main meals are the middle meal. So they fed people their meals at lunch. You went to the cafeteria, you either got a yellow, red, or blue meal, and this was 60 or 70% of their calories. And if they followed people for 2 years, and when you're fed your food, people actually, they were fed lower calories than they needed the first 6 months, so everybody lost weight. But the people that did the best over the course of the 2 years were people that were on the Mediterranean diet, which is high in healthy fats, or people that were on a low-carb diet, which is higher in protein. People that did the worst were people who were on a low-fat diet. Notice they did lose weight, but they didn't keep it off as well. They probably cheated more at home because they really liked the flavor of fat. So again, this speaks to when you're actually feeding people in a clinic setting, this is what works best. Now, the best study ever of the Mediterranean diet was just published last week or 2 weeks ago. It's from Spain. They randomized over 7,000 people to 3 different arms. They actually didn't give them everything they ate. They either gave them the advice to eat a low-fat diet, which is really hard to do in Spain. They actually weren't very compliant with a low-fat diet. Or they schooled them on how to eat a Mediterranean diet. And in some of those people, they gave them extra virgin olive oil. They gave them a huge liter they delivered to their house every week and said, this needs to be part of your diet. And the other group, they came to their house and they gave them nuts to eat every week. And so nuts, they had to have a handful of nuts every day as part of their diets. Now, this wasn't a weight loss study per se. This was to actually look at heart attacks and death from cardiovascular disease. And the top right corner, you can see how well they did. And this was increasing rates of cardiovascular disease and mortality. And the ones that did the worst were the black line, and that's the control diet. That was a low-fat diet. The ones that did the best were those that were schooled on the Mediterranean diet, and either the extra virgin olive oil or the Mediterranean or the nuts were successful in lowering their rates of cardiovascular disease. So this does give us insights into the long-term effects of a Mediterranean diet, or a diet like this that's high in fruits and vegetables, low-fat proteins, and nuts, and in this case, extra virgin olive oil. So again, I want to emphasize the fact that it's a diet. There's not a magic component that you can add to a really bad diet that suddenly makes it good. I think nuts and oils are an important component of the Mediterranean diet. It's not something that were consumed to be a magic bullet. So really, the paramount goal of many diets is to get down to an ideal weight, and really it's probably the ease of adherence for you personally that makes it the most important attribute. What can you do that you can stick with, as opposed to what does Atkins tell me to do? And probably the macronutrient composition may not be as important as the sort of how well you stick with it. And what we're finding out more is that as an individual, it's hard to stick to any diet. I don't care if you do like it. After 3 months or after 6 months, you get tired of doing something, and so you really have to be creative. And the best ways to be creative are to do it with other people, or to have other people egging you on, or have to feel like you have to lose weight with your spouse, with your daughter, with your colleague at work. And so this is one of the best studies of its kind that was done within a clinical setting, where they actually was being supported by the doctor. It's almost like there's a mini wellness community within the doctor's office. And they had the control group where they sort of gave them some advice at the beginning, but the doctor's office wasn't involved. And it wasn't the doctor per se. They were doing it with just sort of remote help, with people saying, how you doing every week? How's it going? Do you have any questions? Can I help you? And they found sort of the in-person support was just as good as calling someone up every week saying, how's it going? So if that works for you, find someone that you really liked and have them call you every week saying, hey, how's it going? But it's better to find a health professional who can answer questions about things you may have in your diet. Is it good to have it there, or is it not good to have it there? So the conclusion so far is successful diets for weight loss can emphasize a large range of macronutrients, although low-fat diets probably are the least effective, most types of low-fat diets. And I really do think that ongoing counseling sessions are important to achieve and maintain weight loss in all groups. And they really can be tailored to the individual. So I don't care of your ethnic background. They really can be tailored to your ethnic background, as long as we find the right healthy foods to fit within that diet. So the government has said choose myplate.gov, and there's lots of information here that the government has. A lot of it is quite accurate and really good, and they give lots of advice on recipes and things like that. Again, we chose the healthy eating plate because everything is in this one icon. There's a lot of great detail here. And you can go to our website also to find more information on the science behind it, as well as some good information on recipes. But I have to emphasize that you shouldn't be in here thinking diet's going to be the only way to do it. And it was an important part of our healthy eating plate to have stay active at the bottom. So I'm hoping that at least some of you walked here and didn't just take the tea. Or if you did take the tea, at least you had a walk here. But that exercise is part of your weekly routine, and that you do find a way to incorporate that with a healthy diet. This is my boss and I getting some exercise. Maybe not a good idea to exercise back and forth at Dunkin' Donuts, but we only do this once a year when we go on a very long bike ride. So we're burning off a lot more calories than we're consuming. And I think that is an important thing, to not say I want to just equal my calorie in with my calorie out, but to be thinking about burning more calories than you're consuming. So should we all just eat more fat? Should we just go on olive oil diets? Well, this is not the right way to do it. Heart Attack Grill spokesman dies from heart attack. I believe he died at age 51. At the All-American Grill, which says people over 350 pounds that come in get to eat free. This is another interesting perspective. This is from an Arby's in Seattle, and as a scientist, I interpreted this as beef and coronary heart disease, 2 for $5. I thought it was a truth in advertising. But I am from Wisconsin, so I realize this means beef and cheddar, not the kinds of fat that we want you to eat. again, the diets with good fats are the ones I think that really people find the most success with. And this is a blurb from the U.S. Dietary Guidelines from 2010 saying that we should increase the amount and variety of seafood consumed by choosing seafood in place of some of those foods that are higher in saturated fat. So the N3 fatty acids, I think, are really an important part of a diet, and we need about 250 milligrams a day, which means that here's a bunch of different types of fish and the average amount of N3 fatty acids they have in them. So if you really only need 250 a day, you really only need to have 1 or 2 servings of salmon a week, some anchovies, some halibut or trout. There's lots of different ways to get healthy N3s, and I think a variety are probably important instead of dwelling on just one. This information is available on nutritionsource.org. So not all fat is created equal. Again, avoid trans fat, that's partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, and saturated fat. N3s are beneficial. If you really don't like seafood, take a supplement. And then eat more monos and polyunsaturated fat. And that's the sort of the liquid cooking oils that you see. Please don't have your salad with a fat-free salad dressing. I don't get it. Have a little oil in your salad dressing. That's healthy oil. It shouldn't be cream, but it's vegetable oil, and that's a healthy oil. There's other parts of a healthy diet that I couldn't cover tonight because I was talking mostly about weight gain, and that's fruits, vegetables, grains, and nuts. But those really are the foundation of what is helping people not feel hungry and to keep weight off, and this is the components of that. But I really like to think of it as food-based. I hate to take a diet and then dissect it into all the healthy things as opposed to talking about the foods, and that's why we have focused on the healthy plate, where we do have the types of foods that are most healthy. And if you like a pyramid, because that's the way some people learned in high school or a long time ago, that we have a pyramid also with the healthy things at the bottom that are the whole grain. Actually, it's all based on exercise, but we have healthy grains and fruits and vegetables and legumes and fish and poultry. So it depends on how you learn best, but I like to visualize a plate because that's how I sit down every day to eat dinner. So a Mediterranean-style diet, I think, is from what we found. The Mediterranean sounds almost like it's exotic, like there's no way we can achieve it because we don't live in the Mediterranean. I hate to tell you, people in the Mediterranean now don't eat the Mediterranean diet. So what it really means is fruits and vegetables, nuts and legumes, and not a lot of high protein, big protein portion sizes. That when you do have protein, it's small, and that it's usually from fish or chicken. And it's nice because it's not focused just on restricting fat. In fact, extra virgin olive oil is an important part of it. And it encourages culinary diversity, so you actually see the food that you're eating and you prepare the food, you touch the food. It actually tastes good. And if you don't like the Mediterranean, you can take that style and apply it to an Asian or a Latin type meal. So is there a magic bullet? That's something that's always asked of me, and there's not a magic bullet. So I think that we know there are certain foods that are particularly good, dark green leafy vegetables, some fruits that are high in anthocyanins, but I personally don't like the term superfood. It's probably something that Dr. Oz says every show because it sensationalizes something. It makes you think like this is it, this is the one thing, and there is not one thing. I think it really is, actually variety is what keeps people interested in eating a healthy diet. If you just ate blueberries every day, all the time, it eventually will, besides causing some GI distress, I think you're going to end up hating blueberries in a few months. So I think variety is really the spice of life. And I would throw in a little extra dark chocolate at the end for goodness sake. I knew I would get a little bit of haze on that one. So the overall summary is there's really no perfect diet. Adherence rules the day. Find a diet that has healthy fats in it that will help. Choose the healthy fats. You can do it on a low-fat diet, but very, very few people are successful at that. Unprocessed foods are best. That helps you really taste the food, absorb the food. It's lower in sodium. You'll feel less hungry. I didn't talk about alcohol, but it's actually not so bad either if consumed in moderation. So that's my summary of an overall healthy diet. Thank you very much. This is where you can find for more information. I think we're going to have some questions at the end, so if you had questions for me, you can write them down and pass them on, and we'll take questions at the end of both of our talks. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions here, so you better be prepared, Eric. Okay, let's move on to our second speaker. who is also very highly informed and a real expert in his area. Dr. Howard Sesso is Associate Epidemiologist at the Divisions of Preventive Medicine and Aging at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Associate Professor at Harvard Medical School. He has his BA from Stanford, MPH from George Washington University, and a doctorate degree in epidemiology from our School of Public Health. He specializes in the epidemiology and prevention of cardiovascular disease, focusing on the role of hypertension, physical activity, obesity, and dietary factors, including antioxidant vitamins, lycopene, flavonoids, and alcohol. One of the important nutrients, of course, and also novel biomarkers that underlie the associations between diet and disease risk, particularly cardiovascular disease. Dr. Sesso is Director of the Nutrition Research and Co-Director of the Hypertension Research at the Division of Preventive Medicine. He's interested in the design and methodology and conduct of epidemiologic studies and randomized trials. He leads the Physicians' Health Study 2, which is a recently completed randomized trial that tested whether common supplemental doses of vitamin E, vitamin C, and a multivitamin affected risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other outcomes. That was really a seminal study, went on for 18 years, much longer than any other study, to my knowledge, has done, and that has turned out to be very important. Dr. Sesso is also currently testing effects of vitamin D in fish oil supplements on blood pressure and the risk of developing hypertension in the very large VITAL study, which is a large study of, indeed, vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids. So without delaying, I'll turn this over to Dr. Sesso.
Good evening. Thanks for your attention. And it's always great to see crowds like this because I think diet and nutrition are such extremely important topics. They surround our life, right? Food is life. And at the same time, you want to learn about how to make food a healthy part of your life. And I actually want to start with one simple question. How many people here take any type of dietary supplement each day? And then how many people take more than one supplement each day? Pretty good percentage. I mean, we're not going to call this a scientific study, but as you can imagine, of course, most of you are it's a pretty informed group. It's throughout our life that we think about taking supplements, whether it be multivitamins or a specific supplement for X, Y, and Z. And I want to kind of put out this idea of what we call the supplement cycle. And as much as it's extremely important, and I think we should always emphasize the important things in terms of the overall dietary approach and the dietary patterns, inevitably, when you go to a CVS or you go to a Walgreens or any other, or a Costco, you're always going to be just as bombarded by lots of choices in terms of supplements. And it's really confusing. It's not just a matter of like, here's one brand of vitamin D or one brand of vitamin C. I mean, there's like tons of things to choose from. And it's very difficult from the consumer standpoint to figure out, one, should I be choosing it? And two, which one do I choose? And what's happened over the years with research, at least with vitamin supplements, is that there's been this pattern, this cycle in which there's a lot of interesting studies that come up. There's a lot of hypotheses that come up. Lots of promising studies. It leads to a lot of observational studies. Those seem to provide perhaps the answer, or maybe even gets onto Dr. Oz's show to a certain extent. And then supplements get developed that start to focus upon particular elements of a diet or a food. And then finally, probably too late in the process, we start doing these large-scale randomized clinical trials that try to definitively test whether or not these supplements actually work. More often than not, they haven't. And I think that's an important thing to remember, at least on first impression. The key is, how do we look at the supplement cycle and think about the type of research that's been done on vitamin supplements? And particularly when you're listening in the news, there's always another study that's coming out saying you should be taking this or should be taking that. How do you sort through that? And I'll try and provide some perspective on that through the course of the next bit of time. So first of all, what is a dietary supplement and why do we take them? So there, without getting in too governmental, there was this act about 2 decades ago that basically said anything that's a dietary supplement is taken by mouth. It contains a dietary ingredient, which is about as broad as you can get, that supplements the diet. And it might include vitamins, it could include minerals, it can include pretty much anything that you can encapsulate. And beyond that, it also can be in the form of tablets. It could be capsules. It could be soft gels. It could be gel caps, liquids. I mean, pretty much it's a very, very catch-all term if you really think about this. Probably most importantly, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, these are considered foods, not drugs. So if you go to the doctor's office, you get diagnosed with hypertension, you go onto an antihypertensive medication, that drug that you're taking, for the most part, has gone through rigorous trials over the course of time, lots of to determine definitively what the efficacy would be. It's not to say that side effects won't happen. You listen to any commercial these days for any new drug, you hear more about all the side effects than you do about the potential benefits. But in the case of dietary supplements, it's a very, very difficult proposition. They're not tested, nor are they regulated like prescription medications. So that's something you always have to take with a certain degree of caution. And many people hope, of course, that these supplements are, in fact, some sort of a magic bullet for disease prevention. And actually, I think the notion of any magic bullet just distracts from the general importance of good nutrition, a balanced diet, everything for the most part in moderation, and also proper lifestyle choices, whether it be exercise, not smoking, making sure your weight is under control, and just general health. So just as we saw with the show of hands before, we know that the prevalence of dietary supplements in the United States is high. So overall, about half of U.S. adults take a supplement of any type. About a third of U.S. adults, or more actually, depending on the survey, take a multivitamin in particular. And the general pattern is that as you get older, more of you take supplements, just as more women than men take supplements. And also, on average, as you start to develop certain conditions in life, you start to be more likely to be taking supplements as well. And through the research that's been done, people who tend to take vitamin and mineral supplements, or people who tend to be older, who are women, have a healthier diet. So a lot of people who are already health conscious in the first place and are trying to pick the right foods also tend to go to look for supplements to kind of provide an extra little boost somehow or another. They also tend to exercise more. And people who take supplements also tend to have been diagnosed with different conditions, which makes sense. If I went in and I just found out that I have high cholesterol, you want to find anything that you can to try and reduce your cholesterol. And a lot of times you turn to supplements, for better or for worse, to try and reduce cholesterol levels, when it's probably just as important, if not more important, to think about taking perhaps a statin or some other lipid-lowering medication, or to improve your diet and the other lifestyle choices that we make. But in general, users tend to be more health conscious. So when we think about vitamins and health, there's been lots of well-done observational studies that have shown that there's been a very consistent association between particularly greater fruit and vegetable consumption and lower rates of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and many other conditions. And we often hear of similarly encouraging research for findings for other foods and other nutrients. And a lot of these have very strong mechanistic support. The hard part is this. So the researchers, of course, hear these studies. So we'll be in a room, we hear about these studies, and we think, all right, well, which foods, which nutrients are responsible for these benefits, and how can we understand what the mechanisms are? The problem is that there's many companies that hear these studies, and they realize, well, how can we bottle a supplement or create a supplement that we can sell that can capture these benefits to improve health and profit? And it's a real concern, especially given the fact that we don't regulate supplements in the way that we do drugs and other types of real medications. Dietary supplement use does tend to increase markedly before randomized trials are actually conducted. And clinical trials are really considered to be essentially the gold standard to evaluate whether something works or not, in the sense that you give a group, you can take this room, for example. One half of you will give a supplement that's really a multivitamin, and the other half we'd give a placebo pill or a sugar pill or a dummy pill. Only that way can you really evaluate what the true efficacy is of a particular supplement on health. So again, the other advantage, and this is one of the trade-offs, so the study, the trial that Dr. Rim had alluded to, that was the Mediterranean diet, that trial that was over about 4 years of time, that's an exception to the rule. It's actually very difficult to do clinical trials testing dietary approaches, dietary patterns, because of compliance, because of the fact that you're asking people to make changes not just in taking a pill, but conforming to a diet for a very long period of time. And so most of the trials that have tended to focus on vitamin supplements, because it's actually more economical. It's much easier, in theory, to take a supplement for a long period of time than it is to actually conform to a diet, which involves a lot more effort. The other thing that's tended to happen is that most of the trials that have been done testing vitamin supplements are of vitamin supplements that are much higher doses than you would usually get through diet alone. And that becomes an issue of generalizability. It'd be nice if you did a vitamin E trial that actually tested what would reflect what you might get from the diet, as opposed to such a high dose of vitamin E that doesn't really reflect what you might get from the studies that we saw in observational research that suggested a benefit for consuming foods that have high amounts of vitamin E to reduce cardiovascular disease. Now, most of the trials that have been done looking at vitamin supplements have focused on individual supplements, so just a single vitamin or a single mineral in relation to cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other outcomes. And that's included trials of beta-carotene, vitamin E, vitamin C, selenium, the B vitamins, also fish oil, and I can go on and on with this list. And I'll walk you through just some of the evidence for some of these nutrients. This is an example of what the trials have shown in contrast to what the observational studies have shown. So beta-carotene, which is primarily usually viewed as carrots, but also other fruits and vegetables, there's been a lot of trials that had tested individual supplements of beta-carotene in, for example, cardiovascular disease. And the trials have shown they're all over the map. Some have suggested there's a potential increased risk. Others have suggested there's no effect of taking beta-carotene over the long term. And then other studies have actually suggested there's a potential reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. From your perspective, when you hear studies that are coming out on another supplement or another nutrient, and every time you hear about a particular nutrient or food or a dietary pattern, if you're hearing something different, it's good, it's bad, it's indifferent, that's usually an indication that we just don't really know what the effects are in reality. No different than if you're hearing again and again the same message. Vitamin D reduces the risk of osteoporosis, and then you hear it again and again. That's usually a good indication that the consistency of the studies, or the consistency of the trials in particular, are conforming to the idea that this is a real potential effect. Vitamin E in particular has gotten a lot of studies, and I think Dr. Rim and I can have a very long conversation about the pros and cons of vitamin E, but the interesting thing with vitamin E is that the observational studies are actually quite compelling, and it really had to do with the fact of what the food sources of vitamin E were in the observational studies. It could be from nuts, and then other foods that we know now from the Mediterranean diet are actually quite beneficial. But lots of trials have looked at vitamin E in cardiovascular disease, and I wouldn't say uniformly null, but uniformly inconsistent is probably the best way to characterize it. At the end of which, there's really no obvious recommendation to take vitamin E individual supplements to prevent cardiovascular disease. The same can be said for vitamin C, at least in the context of cardiovascular disease and cancer. There's been a lot of trials. There's been only, actually compared to vitamin E, as you just saw, there hasn't been as many trials that have tested individual supplements of vitamin C in relation to cardiovascular disease and cancer. But the finding has actually been quite consistent in that there's really no effect. Now, the dose of vitamin C that you see in these trials is about 500 milligrams per day, which is actually quite low compared to if you subscribe to the Linus-Pauling theory of vitamin C, which would suggest you should be taking grams upon grams of vitamin C every day. But we don't have that type of trial evidence to suggest that there's any benefits to taking that high of a dose. So I'd like to focus a little bit more on the concept of multivitamins. Multivitamins in particular are the most common dietary supplement taken by U.S. adults. It's at least a third. Some estimates actually suggest it might be up to a half, if not more. The advantage of a multivitamin potentially is that rather than focus on high doses of individual supplements, you're focusing on lower doses of the combination of the vitamins and minerals that we get naturally in the diet. And the primary goal, though, of a multivitamin, which is often forgotten, is actually to prevent vitamin and mineral deficiency. Yet most of us take them thinking that, well, they couldn't hurt. There must be some benefit to taking it. It's low doses. What's the worst thing that can happen? The problem, though, also is that when you go to the store, there's not just one multivitamin. There's countless formulations to choose from, even if, whether it's Centrum Silver or the One a Day or some of the other brands. Even I think if you go to Costco or Sam's Club, they've got so many different versions of a multivitamin to choose from, it makes it even more complicated. When we look at the research in multivitamins, we found that the observational studies were actually quite inconsistent. Some suggested benefits, some suggested no effect, others risks. Yet we still keep taking them. Despite the fact that until recently, there were no large-scale long-term trials that had actually tested whether a standard common multivitamin had any role in the prevention of chronic disease. So I'd like to digress a little bit. So one trial that I've been involved with over the last decade plus is a trial called the Physician's Health Study 2. And this is the only trial of its kind that's tested a standard multivitamin, which happened to be a Centrum Silver multivitamin. And we tested this in nearly 15,000 physicians around the country who were aged 50 years and older at the start. And they were followed on average, for more than 11 years. They kept taking either a multivitamin or a placebo without knowing what it was going to be. And unlike what you see in the dietary intervention trials when you're changing diet for a long period of time, the compliance when you're taking a pill, for better or for worse, tends to be higher. So after more than a decade of treatment and follow-up, more than 2/3 of the men in the trial were still taking the pills as we had asked them to. And our two endpoints focus on cardiovascular disease and cancer. So the other potential advantage of a supplement is that they're easier to test in trials. We had a calendar pack that we would send out by mail to these participants. It was easy for them to keep it with them and take it and keep track of the days of the month. It became a bit of a status symbol, so they'd carry these pills wherever they would go around the world. And it also became a bit of a challenge from among the participants to see who can take the pills the furthest away from home, and not to mention trying to get them through customs at times as well. So the nice part, though, is that again these are trial data that just came out in the fall of last year. Now, believe it or not, there's two lines there. It's hard to tell. And what this suggests and demonstrates actually quite definitively is that for the outcome of major cardiovascular events, taking a multivitamin doesn't do anything for it. Now, if you look at some of the individual endpoints, again, if you look at the column that says HR, that stands for hazard ratio. Anything below 1 suggests that there's benefit. Anything above 1 suggests harm. There's really no obvious patterns other than a very small blip that there might be a lower risk of death from a heart attack. But for the most part, we found no effect of a multivitamin on cardiovascular disease. When we looked at cancer, we actually found a different story. Now, these lines might not look that different from each other. But given the fact that these were nearly 15,000 men that were followed for, on average, 11 years and longer, that little difference where that red line, which is the placebo group, had higher rates of cancer compared to those who were on the multivitamin. And in fact, what we found after 11 years of treatment and follow-up is that men who were taking a daily multivitamin had an 8% significant reduced risk of total cancer. And in fact, if you look at some of the site-specific cancers, the finding was quite consistent. And even more interestingly, if you look at the very bottom row, men who had a history of cancer at the start of the trial actually had a 27% significant reduction in the risk of total cancer. So what we found from this trial, which is actually in contrast to most of the other trials that have been done looking at individual vitamin supplements, was that, first of all, you can't forget, the main reason that you consider taking a multivitamin is to prevent deficiency. But we did find that taking a daily multivitamin reduced the risk of total cancer by 8%, but had no effect on cardiovascular disease. So don't take it for your heart, perhaps take it to prevent cancer. But there's always limitations with trials that often get lost in the shuffle. What about women? We didn't study women, we studied men. So how did those results extend to women? I think that remains an open question. Not to mention, we studied men who are 50 and up. What about younger adults or younger, my kids take multivitamins. How is that going to impact their life decades down the road? The decision to take a multivitamin, like any other vitamin supplement, needs to be a careful conversation with your primary care physician. And at least in the terms of a multivitamin, it needs to be thought of in the context of its potential reductions in cancer risk. And we do have other studies, two other trial results that will be coming out in the coming months looking at eye disease and cognitive function, so you can be on the lookout for that as well. Now, we can go on to another supplement and stay here for hours. But I just want to mention a few others in particular that are often tossed about. You'll hear it on different shows. You'll see it in advertisements in the stores. Vitamin D, you can actually argue, is kind of the vitamin of the day right now. No differently than what beta-carotene was in the 1970s into the 1980s, no differently than what vitamin E was in the 1990s into the 2000s. And vitamin D has a lot of good things going for it. It's got a set of unique risk factors to have low levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which I'm guessing many of you might have had measured perhaps at your doctor's office. Living in northern latitudes is a risk factor, avoiding the sun, dark skin pigmentation. And there's a lot of good observational studies that have been conducted that have suggested that vitamin D might prevent cancer and cardiovascular disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the trials remain inconclusive. So before we jump to the conclusion and the assumption that taking something like vitamin D is beneficial, we don't know. The good news is that we do have a new large-scale trial that has just been initiated over the last few years called the VITAL trial that is testing in more than what will be about 27,000 US adults, men and women around the country, to see what the long-term effects of vitamin D supplements are on these types of conditions. Of course, there's other ones. So there's omega-3 fatty acids, thinking about fish intake, soy protein, thinking about tofu, flavonols that you might find in tea or in cocoa or dark chocolate, resveratrol, which is what you'll see in red wine, and lots of other vitamins and minerals and nutrients. Not to mention all the other herbal supplements that are on the market. Virtually all of these, particularly the ones that are a little bit more esoteric, you can be sure that the type of trial evidence that you'd want to have for those supplements probably isn't there. So what kind of lessons have we learned? So despite the lack of benefits seen for many vitamin supplements that we've tested in the larger scale clinical trials, their use persists. We all still take them. Now, can a vitamin supplement help? Maybe. We don't really know, though. And it's, again, always important to consult with your primary care physician to think about what you might consider taking and whether it's something that's practical to take or not. But keep in mind, it's very difficult to know what the optimal dose is or what the optimal formulation is. There's lots of them to choose from. And if anything, we know that most chronic diseases are multifactorial. In other words, we know there's lots of risk factors for cancer, lots of risk factors for cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes. There's no way that a supplement's going to be representing all those risk factors. And it's just as important that we have to remind ourselves to focus on the healthier dietary patterns that we know a lot more about. And as one example, as Dr. Rim alluded to also, the recent trial results of the Mediterranean diet are a good reminder of how a long-term dietary strategy can lead to the prevention, hopefully, of cardiovascular disease. And there's always going to be a revolving door of new supplements that are going to hit the market and hit the shelves. And it's not to say you should never consider taking any of them, but be wary of them and be selective and think about whether you really need to take it or not. And ideally, we'd like to be able to take the supplement cycle where we keep on thinking we have an answer, and then we do the trials and we exit out. And it would be nice to be able to find eventually, with research eventually, a way to actually find that answer and get rid of this cycle that we've been in. So thank you for your time and attention, and we'll go from here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sesso and Dr. Rim, for some very informed introductions to these topics. And I think you're probably well aware that either of these individuals could talk for another 3 or 4 hours on their own topic. There's so much depth and detail that they're really knowledgeable about. But we have a lot of questions here, so we have about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, according to my watch here. So we'll start right off with some of these some questions. And maybe I'll pose this one to Dr. Rim. What about organic fruits and vegetables?
There's not a ton of science on organic fruits and vegetables. What we know right now about organic fruits and vegetables is that nutrient-wise, they have the same nutrients that non-organic fruits and vegetables have. That's been pretty well tested that growing an organic raspberry, you'll get the same amount of flavonoids in the raspberry that you would get if it's an inorganic one. What we do know, obviously, is that the contaminants that are in pesticides are not in the organic raspberry for the most part. So There are, in addition, the only few other things that have been seen more in organic fruits and vegetables is that the fruit or vegetable tries to create its own defense system because it's not being sprayed to protect it from the bugs. And so there are a few antioxidant compounds that are actually higher in organic fruits and vegetables. Whether they have more benefit, we don't know. But it's the only few things that have been seen that are a bit higher in organic fruits and vegetables. So if you're trying to choose between, I can't afford this, should I just have the inorganic or the whatever regular fruit and vegetable, I would say yes. Have the regular fruit and vegetable, and it's better than saying I can't afford either. Forget it. I'm going to go have crackers.
Great answer. This one is written for Dr. Rim. Salmon, farm versus wild. Looks like your farm salmon had a lot more omega-3 fatty acids in that from your slide, someone noticed.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier to fish for farm salmon because they're all sitting in a pen in front of you. But if you're thinking about what to eat, yeah, I mean, for the most part, the reason that in this particular analysis that we did in the summary literature, the farm salmon had more omega-3s is because farm salmon have what they're fed. And so if they are fed fish meal, they then have higher amounts of omega-3 than the wild salmon that have to swim around and burn off some of the fat. So you'll find that the flavor is somewhat different. I think that the evidence from the work that Howie has done and that I've done is that regardless of the fish you're eating, it gives you substantial benefit. So there are always some concerns. I'm worried about the pesticides that may be in the farm salmon because it's eating fish meal and runoff from the mountains where it's such a tiny amount compared to the huge cardiovascular benefit that you get from eating fish that the evidence is so much more overwhelming for benefit from fish regardless of what you're eating than any minute unproven risk of anything else that may be in the fish. So please don't choose fish based on the wild or farmed. Choose it based on the fact that you're having fish instead of a cheeseburger.
Yeah, lots of issues are issues of trade-offs of risk and benefits, as Dr. Rim was describing. Here's another one I'll give to him, and it's what about wine with food or dinner? And then another question asked: alcohol has been linked with breast cancer. Is it recommended to eliminate consumption by people at high risk for breast cancer?
That's a great question. I'd like to have Howie do a long-term clinical trial of alcohol for 10 years. It's one of those things, I mean, it wouldn't be ethical to randomize people to not drinking, I understand, but...
Compliance would be interesting.
Yeah, compliance would be interesting. We could probably get many people to volunteer. This is one of those areas where there's a tremendous amount of observational data. And the nice thing is that it's been done in U.S. physicians, but it's also been done in people in Finland and people in China, people all across the world that have looked at the effects of alcohol. And it's not just red wine, it's the effects of alcohol, whether it be beer, gin, or white wine. It's all very similar. There's not tremendously more benefit from having red wine. But it's clear. I mean, alcohol clearly lowers risk of heart attacks and clearly increases risk of breast cancer. Now, many more of us die of heart attacks than die of breast cancer, but nonetheless, you don't wake up in the morning and say, what am I going to try to prevent today? And what supplement should I take or what food should I eat because I'm focused on breast cancer today and tomorrow I'll worry about heart disease. So, for the case of alcohol, what we can do is look at studies where they follow people who die of anything. You follow 1 million people, follow them for 10 years, look at their drinking habits at the beginning, and who lives the longest. People that live the longest are people that drink a drink a day. There's no question that people that don't drink don't live as long, and people that drink 4 drinks a day don't live as long. The question is, what do you do if you know you're at very high risk of breast cancer? And those women, I would say it's a shame to eliminate alcohol altogether because heart disease still is the #1 killer of women. So I think you could drink less. I think maybe drinking a couple drinks a week would be okay. You still would get some of the cardiovascular benefit and not have the same breast cancer risk. So again, it's up to the individual. It's not a global blanket recommendation you can make, and you can discuss that with your physician if he or she knows the evidence on alcohol. But it's really one of those things where you should not look at tomorrow's headline on alcohol, whatever it is, because there's 35 years of awesome literature in this area. It's going to be hard to change what's been published over the last 35 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a good point, that this is an area where we have great confidence in the answers, the relationship of alcohol to heart disease, beneficial, and also the relationship with alcohol to breast cancer, increased risk. And so even when you have the perfect scientific answer, it doesn't provide, in every case, exact guidance as to what an individual can do. Sort of one of the other flip sides of the point that Dr. Rim made, if you're really very low risk for heart disease, then there's not going to be very much benefit for drinking alcohol in terms of reduction. So especially, say, if a woman's 45 years old and doesn't have cardiovascular risk factors, that applies to a lot of people, there's almost certainly going to be more harm from the breast cancer than the benefit for reducing cardiovascular risk if the risk was already very low to begin with. So it does depend on risk factors, and particularly age, that for women under 55 or 60, unless they really have substantial heart disease risk, the breast cancer risk does mount up. And we can even see now with one drink every other day, there's a measurable, small but measurable increase in risk of breast cancer. It's pretty impressive how sensitive the breast tissue is to alcohol. But it's not an all or nothing answer, as Dr. Rim mentioned. But it does, I think, probably suggest that women might want to get very good wine and drink it drop by drop and really enjoy it. So, what about coconut oil? Is that good for your heart health? Maybe, Dr. Cecil, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, I think the short answer is no. And I think I'll leave it at that. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those issues where we've done, thanks to Dr. Willett, we've done an awesome job of taking the hydrogenated oils out of the food supply. It's estimated that 70 to 80% of partially hydrogenated oils have been taken out of the food supply because food processors have changed what's in their food, because Dr. Willett was so effective at getting trans fat on the label, so everybody was scared to have trans fat, so they took it out of their foods. Some foods are really hard to make without having some oil that's a little bit hard to keep the food a little more solid. So they've snuck in a little bit of coconut oil or a little bit of palm oil, which has a little bit of saturated fat. So a small bit is probably not a terrible thing, but it is a source of saturated fat. So as a solution of cooking with palm oil or cooking with something that has a lot of palm or coconut oil, it's probably not the best solution.
Yeah, I quite agree with that. And there are some dishes from Thailand, for example, or other parts of the world that are made with coconut oil where the flavor is really an essential part of the dish. So I think having it now and then where you really do want that flavor, that's fine. There is a very high amount of saturated fat in coconut oil, but it's not poison if you have it in modest amounts. But I wouldn't, at this point, from what we know, even though I must say we don't have any long-term studies of coconut oil users, still from what we know, it would be better for the basic cooking fat to use some other type of more unsaturated fat.
The place actually where it scares people the most is that when you're getting a dessert or something like that, you go, oh, I think I'll have the non-fat cookie instead of the cookie that may be slightly lower calories and have a little bit of coconut oil. In that case, I would actually have the cookie with a little bit of coconut oil. One, it's fewer calories, but the highly processed, highly sugared, sodium, non-fat cookie is probably the worst thing that you can do. Because not only is it higher in calories, but you're going to be a lot hungrier an hour or two later because you had a highly processed carbohydrate.
Actually, it's what I used to term the Snackwell effect. So about 10 or 20 years ago, they used to be on the shelves, what they called Snackwells, which were these cookies that were basically no-fat cookies, but had everything else that you didn't want to have in it. And that's kind of perpetuated, it's kind of propagated itself. But those are the things to avoid.
Okay, an interesting question. What is coconut oil? Where did it originate? Why is it good for you? And is it as good as olive oil? And we could talk for a long time about that. It is an example, if you go to the web, you'll find everything from canola oil being a super good food because it's high in omega-3 fatty acids, which is true, it is high in omega-3 fatty acids, to being toxic and poison and the last thing in the world you'd want to consume. But actually, canola oil is a derivative of...
Walt, did you say canola or coconut?
Canola.
Oh, you said canola initially, so you meant
sorry.
canola.
It's canola, right.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is canola oil good for you? That is a better question.
Right. So, yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Eric. But so that the coconut oil is a derivative of the mustard plant that is one of the traditional oils of India. And it's interesting. I just recently had mustard oil I used to prepare greens with, and it just is incredibly beautifully aromatic and flavorful. But the coconut oil was bred to optimize a little bit the fatty acids that were in the traditional mustard oil, but all the flavor is taken out of it in the processing of it. So it comes from India originally as mustard oil with not high-tech genetic modification, but through selection processes is a little bit different. In Europe, it's called rapeseed oil, but they figured that wouldn't go over in American kitchens very well, so they named it canola oil, which is short for Canadian oil, because a lot of it is produced in Canada. So is it good for you? It's a good oil, basically a good oil. It is almost entirely unsaturated fat. Most of it's monounsaturated fat, but it has an unusually substantial amount of omega-3 fatty acids, about 10%. And whether that's good for you or how good it is for you really depends on what you're eating in the rest of your diet. There are parts of the world where people have almost no access to fish, and consuming oils that have almost no omega-3 fatty acids in them. Bulgaria is one country, for example, we're studying right now. It has the highest heart disease rates in the world, probably partly due to the almost non-existent omega-3 fatty acids in their diet. So for them, some canola oil would be really good because it would add omega-3 fatty acids. If you're already eating fish on a regular basis and maybe consuming some other sources of omega-3 fatty acids, it's not so clear whether the additional omega-3 fatty acids that we get from canola oil would really add that much. Is it as good as olive oil? We know with olive oil that people have lived on that for thousands of years, and hence the Mediterranean diet that was just studied. And that we know is a very healthy oil. So I usually use mostly olive oil in my diet, but I try to have some source of omega-3 fatty acids in addition to that, whether it be fish or sometimes canola oil. So it really does, again, it depends on, as many things do in nutrition, what else you're having in your diet. You need some omega-3 fatty acids, and canola oil can be a good source.
But if you're thinking about oils to cook with, if you're trying to make a decision in the store, what should I buy to cook with? It's clearly much better to have olive oil or canola oil than it is to have a sort of the hardened, old-time, whatever that spread was called.
Right.
Some of the Wesson oils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Rim, what does SCD stand for?
We both have an SCD, and we both have a Doctor of Science, which is the School of Public Health stuck-up way of giving you a PhD.
Okay.
Sorry. The Dean of the School of Public Health is not here.
Okay.
But yeah, it's, Harvard and Hopkins give out Doctors of Sciences instead of PhD. It's a long story, and we apologize.
Okay, based on your research, Dr. Rim, is eating eggs daily a good idea? And what about egg substitutes rather than regular eggs, egg beaters, for example?
Yeah, I think it's this is a case where moderation is not so bad. It's a complete protein. It's a great source of protein. All of our studies suggest that up to 1 egg a day is not so bad. In fact, it may be beneficial for some chronic diseases. And it's probably in part because it's a good protein. It fills you up a bit more. And instead of eating something which is a processed carbohydrate, you're eating a good protein. So I do think, where you may run into problems is when people get to having a 3 or 4 egg omelet every day, and they happen to have it with sausage and cheese. So, it's sort of what you're eating your egg with. And I do think an egg substitute is fine. Again, I like choosing whole foods instead of sort of recreating my meal in front of me. But if you're really terribly worried about your cholesterol, for the most part, we should remember that the cholesterol you eat does not correlate very well with the cholesterol that circulates in your blood. Really, what drives the cholesterol in your blood is eating a lot of bad saturated fat and trans fat. So the cholesterol you eat is really not as important until you really get up to eating a lot of eggs a day. So I think it's actually not a bad idea to incorporate eggs into your diet 3 or 4 a week. It's probably just fine, and that's where evidence shows that there's the greatest health benefits.
I think if anything, it just speaks to the theme that we're trying to preach here, was that diversity of foods as well as moderation of foods. Don't just put all your chips on one. It's almost like the mutual fund of dietary approaches, right? You want to spread yourself relatively thin, but also diverse amongst the food groups that we know do the best. That's fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and other foods like that.
Yeah. I think this is one area where research has actually given us confidence. Oftentimes research is viewed as something that identifies hazards and harms, but here eggs were considered a real hazard, and we have a lot of data from our research that shows that they're not so harmful after all, and it's fine to introduce eggs in a moderate way, as both Dr. Rim and Dr. Sesso were describing. Dr. Rim, I don't know. People have all their questions for you here. Could you explain further why we should not use low-calorie salad dressings?
Sure. There's more questions for me because I went first. Yeah, so what's in a low-calorie salad dressing? Look at the label. Actually, that should be the message for everybody. When you pick up a food, you're trying to decide, look at the label. Look at the order of ingredients is the order of the composition of the food you're eating. So the first ingredient is the most important one. So if you're buying bread, make sure the first ingredient says whole grain, whatever, instead of wheat flour or oat flour. It should say whole grain. So for salad dressing, you pick it up, and the first ingredient should say canola oil, soybean oil, or olive oil, because it's a healthy oil. It's a liquid oil. It's a mono or polyunsaturated fat. If you're buying a non-fat oil, the first ingredient is probably going to be water. The second ingredient is likely to be sugar. And eventually you'll get down to some guar things and some other things that are words that you and I can't read and don't know what they mean. And then there's a little bit more sodium, and then there's seasons and flavorings at the end. So what is that? I mean, I guess it's helping you eat your salad, but really what you're having is sugared water that's salted down with a bunch of other artificial ingredients. So to me, that's not a salad dressing. It's much easier just to get a little olive oil and put it on it if you'd like, or to get a salad dressing where the first ingredient actually is a healthy vegetable oil.
Great. There's a couple of topics here on calcium, which maybe I'll try to answer. It's been a topic of a lot of confusion, and I can't provide the full story here. It's a complicated one. This question said, I read a small article in Science section of the New York Times about calcium supplements for older women. It said that most women didn't need extra calcium because they get enough in a regular healthy diet. Too much calcium can cause elevated levels of a protein in the blood that's related to heart attacks. Another question asked about drinking calcium-fortified orange juice, and there were some series of articles in the news in the last few days because the Preventive Services Task Force, a review committee, released a report saying that people should not take supplements containing 1,000 milligrams of calcium and 400 IU of vitamin D. And I knew that was going to cause a lot of confusion. That was a very confusing report that they issued. The big picture here is that the RDA, the requirement that in the U.S. for calcium, is almost surely very much overstated compared to reality. To put it in context, for women over 50 years of age, the official DRI or RDA for calcium in this country is 1,200 milligrams a day. In England, they reviewed the evidence. They came up with 700 milligrams a day, and the World Health Organization says 500 milligrams a day is adequate. And I think the World Health Organization number is probably really the right number. The kinds of evidence used to set this very high calcium requirement is just bound to give you the wrong answer. And of course, the dairy industry loves that very high number because that underlies the recommendation to drink lots of milk for preventing fractures. And the evidence is that there's no relationship between high dairy consumption and fracture risk. That's been looked at really quite exhaustively, and it just shows no reduction in fracture risk with high dairy consumption. So I think this new report was correct that we don't really need that much calcium, that 1,000 milligrams added on top of a diet that for most people is probably already adequate. But so in reality, I think the bottom line there is if someone's having 1 or 2 servings of dairy a day, that's enough calcium unless one has a specific medical reason to take more calcium. If you're not taking any dairy at all, then 500 milligrams a day will add you some insurance. You probably don't even need that, but it'll make sure you're getting enough if you take 500 milligrams on top of your regular diet, which will give you some calcium even if you're not consuming any dairy. The vitamin D side of the story is, of course, much more complicated. Dr. Cecil referred to that a little bit, but it is pretty clear that 400 IUs a day is probably not enough. But there is quite a bit of evidence that higher amounts, at least 800 or 1,000 international units a day, will reduce fracture risk. And for me, that's good enough. If the trials trials show nothing, well, maybe you might think about whether we need it or not. But one of the problems is that trials often don't go long enough to give you the true answer. And Dr. Cecil's study showing the multiple vitamins was an important study because it did go on for 18 years. No other studies gone on for that long. If they had gone on for a shorter period of time, they almost surely would have missed the benefit of taking the multiple vitamin supplement. So that I think it is very rational for people to take extra vitamin D living here in this part of the country where we don't get enough sunlight and our blood levels really are low. We'll wait, of course, for further data, but in the meantime, I think that's pretty rational. But we don't need all that dairy consumption. That seems pretty secure. So there's a red light blinking in front of me here. I guess. Well, I think we're going to need to stop here. And there are obviously complicated medical questions for an individual basis. Those are the kind of things you really do need to discuss if you have a diagnosis with your physician. So thanks very much to our speakers. And thank everybody else for joining us here today.